MMA is a sport where two fighters can beat each other to a bloody pulp before the referee steps in. With some of the best strikers in the world, it tends to get much messier than boxing, but some of these are the best fights of all time. So stay tuned as we count down the bloodiest fight in MMA history. First up, Cain Velasquez versus Antonio Silva. If there's one guy you don't want to get hit by from the UFC, it's Cain Velasquez. The heavyweight slams his fists into faces like weighted hammers. That's how Velasquez twice became heavyweight champion, knocking out the likes of Brock Lesnar, Junior Dos Santos, and Antonio Silva. At UFC 146, he was up against Antonio Bigfoot Silva, and like most of his opponents, Silva was bigger than Velasquez. But once the bell rang for the start of the first round, it was clear that this was Cain's fight to win. He immediately blocked a kick and used it to flawlessly counter with a takedown to begin launching elbows and punches from the top. Silva tried to push him off, but got his face cut up as he struggled to break free. As they rolled around, the blood from Silva's head made a pool around them, spraying with each of Velasquez's punches. With blood dripping into his eyes, Silva was struggling to see. It got so bad that the referee paused the fight to have the doctor check Silva's cut. Some blood was wiped away, but there wasn't much else that could be done. Silva kept shaking his head to clear up his vision, and in the meantime, he had to deal with Velasquez holding him down and striking him. After a minute of more brutal hits to the head, the fight was stopped by TKO. Cain stood up to celebrate and barely had a scratch on him, while Silva was a bloody mess. Now Jonathan Goulet versus Jay Heron. Jonathan Goulet and Jay Heron. You might not have heard of these fighters, but back in 2005, they were among a group of rising stars in the UFC. At UFC Fight Night 2, the commentators were excited to see what they could produce in what could have been an important fight in both of their careers. Heron didn't take long to put Goulet on his back and start delivering some damage. Goulet was able to wriggle free, but just as soon as he did, he was taken down again and fighting off submission attempts. Goulet broke free once again, and that's when the tables turned. The Canadian caught Heron with a number of knees and punches that left Heron bleeding badly from his head. It just showed that the stats don't show the full story. Heron had seemed to dominate the first round, but he was the one hurting. In the second round, it was an unpredictable fight. Goulet found his feet and ended up being the one delivering the damage. Incredibly, it went to a third round, where the fight was shortly stopped after a doctor assessed the injury. It was definitely one of the bloodiest and most unpredictable fights in recent memory, so if you want to watch two warriors battling it out in the catch, it's worth a watch. Up next, Ricardo Arona versus Kazushi Sakuraba. If you're an old school MMA fan, then you'll remember the days of Pride. It was a Japanese MMA promotion that rivaled the UFC. It was home to legendary fighters like Fedor Emelianenko, Wanderlei Silva, and Vitor Belfort, before they moved to US organizations. But two names you might not recognize are Ricardo Arona and Kazushi Sakuraba. By the time Arona faced Sakuraba, he had a record of 11-2, and would have had a 9-fight win streak if it weren't interrupted by the one loss to Quinton Jackson. Arona never became a Pride champion, but he was a serious contender who would go on to take out names like Wanderlei Silva and Alistair Overeem. Kazushi Sakuraba, on the other hand, was the Japanese contender whose record was a little less impressive. His stats were 17-8-1 coming into this fight with Arona, so he was the clear underdog, but nobody could imagine just how brutal a loss it would turn into. Arona put Sakuraba in a headlock and slammed his knee into his head. When they stood up, it was the Brazilian who outclassed the Japanese until he had him on the ground again. Unlike UFC, Pride allowed fighters to kick and knee their opponents while they were on the floor, and a nasty kick to the head opened up a big cut on Sakuraba's eye. There was one round to go, but Sakuraba's face was so smashed up that his corner forfeited the fight. Fair enough. The man was taking a serious beating. Coming up, which bloody battle was so good that it won Fight of the Year, and which dominant championship win left an opponent in a pool of blood gasping for air? So don't go anywhere. And now, Conor McGregor versus Nate Diaz 2. This one may not have been the most bloody of fights, but it was a pure slugfest that ended in both fighters drenched in blood. Coming into UFC 202, Conor McGregor's mantra of precision beats power, timing beats speed was on full display. His opponent, Nate Diaz, was likely the stronger of the two, but the Irishman outclassed him throughout the first round. His head movement, countering, and attacking were just too well executed for Diaz. But as the fight went on, it moved into Nate's comfort zone. That was exactly how things played out when Diaz won their first matchup. He is known for his excellent cardio, and 5 rounds for him is a walk in the park. Diaz put the pressure on with some grappling, but Conor made it past the point where his energy dropped in the first fight and somehow found a second win. By this point, they were both covered in blood, but they kept trading blows. McGregor was clearly tired, even walking away at some point. At the end of the final round, Diaz was on top trying to better McGregor into submission, but it didn't work. The fight went to the judges and McGregor won by majority decision. It was a performance worthy of champions, and they raised each other's hands after the final bell. Conor McGregor showing sportsmanship? Man, has he changed. Next, Lawler versus McDonald 2. At UFC 189, most eyes were on Conor McGregor as he continued to ascend to an inevitable clash with featherweight champion Jose Aldo. But on the undercard of that event was a fight between two of the toughest guys in MMA history. Welterweight champion Robbie Lawler was taking on Rory McDonald. The challenger had laid waste to 3 contenders in the build-up to the fight, including Tyron Woodley. Meanwhile, Lawler had won the welterweight belt in his 7th fight back in the UFC. He had been busy winning the championship at Elite XC and fighting at Strikeforce after just 2 years at the UFC. At UFC 189, Lawler and McDonald were both at their best. Robbie is known as the brawler, and Rory definitely rose to the occasion. The two felt each other out the first round before things started to heat up in the second. As damage was traded, McDonald was taking it harder. Lawler was a little faster, which made all the difference. By the third round, McDonald's entire face was red with blood, but it didn't slow him down. He almost finished Lawler with head kicks and flying knees at the end of that round, but Lawler weathered the storm to take it to the fourth round. The battering continued, but Lawler was able to compose himself. That's when in the final round, Lawler knocked him down with a straight left hand to McDonald's already shattered nose. With that, Lawler retained his title and the bout was ranked Fight of the Year by two different MMA outlets. And now BJ Penn versus Joe Stevenson, UFC 80. Coming into UFC 80, BJ Penn was the big name. He had already been welterweight champion and had returned to lightweight just one fight earlier. Already he was given a shot at the belt after Sean Shirk was stripped for testing positive for steroids. That left the title vacant, and it was decided that Penn would fight Joe Stevenson for it, which was no easy task. Stevenson had won the Ultimate Fighter Season 2 and was in fine form on a 4-fight win streak. Unfortunately for him, that wasn't enough to challenge one of the greatest fighters to ever compete in the UFC. It only took a few seconds for Penn to knock Stevenson to the ground, and from there, he was all over him. By the end of the round, Penn was still on top and had opened up a huge gash on Stevenson's forehead. With blood splattering everywhere, he gasped for air until the bell rang. That gave Stevenson some time to recover, and his medic quickly got to work at closing up his cuts. But as he started to get hit again, his face was soon totally covered in blood. Veteran referee Herb Dean briefly stopped the fight for a doctor's check, and then it was back to total Penn domination. BJ rolled his opponent around with total control before submitting him with a rear naked choke in the second round. That performance made BJ Penn the first fighter to win the championship in 2 weight classes in the UFC. Not bad for a kid from Hawaii. Which bloody fight was your favorite from the list? Let us know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.